Hello, I'm Dave from Wizards Keep in Muncie, Indiana, and today I'm going to continue counting down my list of top 60 board games of all time. In this video, I'll be counting down my 30 through 21. And we'll cut right to it. My number 30 is Betrayal at House on the Hill. What I like about this game is all about the theme of the game. The mechanics are pretty simple, but which is nice because you can play this game with anybody. You got bunch of non-gamer friends that can't handle or don't have no interest that gets overwhelmed by some like the maybe deeper or heavier board games. Anybody can play this one. And it's the theme about this game that really kind of just is the crux of the game. In Betrayal at House on the Hill, you're a group that are kind of, for whatever reason, stumbled into this haunted, creepy mansion on the hill. And you're going to be investigating the mansion, which is basically building the mansion as you go. And how you do that is you go through a room or go through a doorway, you're going to grab a tile and place a new room out in front of you. And in that room, there's going to be a different symbol. It may trigger like there's an event that happens in the room. You might find an item in the room, or you might find an omen. And if you find an omen, you make a die roll, and if you roll less than the number of omens drawn by all the other players, then you trigger what's called the haunt. And what that means is that one of the players is going to become a traitor, hence the betrayal at the House on the Hill. And it could be, and I guess what you do at that point is you'll look in the book, the rule booklet, and it will tell you based on which omen card was drawn and which room that the omen card was drawn in. It will tell you what scenario you're playing and who the traitor is. It could be the haunt revealer. It could be the person with the fastest speed or the lowest sanity. Usually it's determined for game balancing based on the scenario you're going to play, who the traitor is. But and then usually at that point you're going to take a break. The traitor's going to go in the other room, and so they're going to read what they're trying to do to win the game, and then everybody else is going to read what is it they're trying to do to win the game. And it could be something like the mansion was secretly the last lair of some vampire lord, and the traitor is a thrall to that vampire and has lured you into this mansion as sacrifices to waken this vampire lord once again. So the traitor is going to be trying to find different ways to wake the vampire lord, whereas all the heroes are going to be trying to find probably where the vampire lord's remains are and vanquish him before he wakes up. And that just kind of that's kind of an example of what a scenario in this might be like. I don't think that's actually a scenario in this game. But there are 50 different scenarios in here. And each scenario takes us about 45 minutes to an hour to play. And that's really the kind of example of how fun this game is. Usually when I sit down and play, we'll play through a scenario and go, oh man, that was awesome. Let's do it again. And so then we'll play maybe 2 or 3 scenarios in one sitting. And the nice thing about that is it gives not only playing different scenarios, you're seeing different stories, but also gives a chance for different people to become the traitor. And that's just one of the I can't say enough good things about Betrayal at House on the Hill. And that's my number 30. My number 29 is kind of a simple 2-player game by designer Uwe Rosenberg, and that is Patchwork. Now Patchwork, what you're doing in Patchwork is it's a quilting game where you're taking different patches. They're just kind of like odd shaped scrap pieces of fabric that you're trying to make your quilt out of. And so on your turn, you're going to basically be deciding, you're paying buttons, which is currency, to buy different patches that you're going to place on your home board. And you're trying to fill up all the spaces on your home board. But the pieces are going to be these odd Tetris-like shapes. So you're trying to efficiently fill up spaces on your board, figure out how they're going to connect together in a limited amount of time, and do a better job of that than your opponent's doing. So it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but it's a great filler game and with a lot of strategy. And you can see that Uwe Rosenberg is kind of like this concept because he's kind of incorporated this into some other games of his design, like Cottage Garden and End in Summer, or even Feast for Odin has these kind of concepts of taking these odd pieces and trying to fill them efficiently on a board. My number 28 is it's a Days of Wonder game. Days of Wonder always has excellent components and excellent production on their games, and this one's no exception to that, and that is 5 Tribes. Now, Five Tribes is what they call a Mancala game or a Mancala mechanic. What that means is you're going to have a board here, and you kind of see a little on the back. On the board, there's going to be several different tiles, and each tile is going to have a X number of meeples on them. And on your turn, you're going to kind of scoop up all the meeples off of the tile, and you're going to kind of walk them around to different tiles, dropping off a meeple as you go. So if you picked up like 4 meeples, you're going to move 4 other spaces, dropping off 1 meeple on each tile. And then on the last tile, when you drop off your last meeple, it has to match a color of a meeple that's already on that tile. So you got to kind of limit some of your options. But there's always, that's the thing about this game, there is tons and tons of options or tons of choices that you're trying to do on your turn. And not only do you have to figure out what's your best option, you have to be very careful because this is a game where you can set up your opponents. Because if you place, because you're placing meeples, you're changing the board, and so you could give your opponent options like, oh, thank you for placing that meeple in that spot. Now I can kind of go off, sort of like it's nothing like, this game doesn't play anything like checkers, but it kind of reminds me of in like a classic checkers game where you move one piece and your opponent goes, oh, thanks, and then you jump like 3 of your pieces in a row. That kind of concept is very, very possible in Five Tribes. So I really like that about this one because it makes you kind of think. It's kind of a puzzle each turn. You're trying to figure out, okay, what can I do to maximize my points, but make sure I don't set up my opponents. So it's very, very thinky. Which might be, if you've got somebody that has a lot of analysis paralysis prone to that, that might be, maybe this is a game to avoid. But if you're into those kind of thinky, puzzly like games, definitely check out Five Tribes. Kind of on that same lines is my number 27, because it's another puzzly like game, and it's also by Days of Wonder. And that is Quadropple. Now, Quadropple is a city building game, or it's kind of the theme is you're kind of building your city. In my last video, I talked about Suburbia, which was another city building type game, and kind of Sim Cities where you're kind of laying different tiles out. But Quadropple is a little more puzzly, and Suburbia was all about different tile synergies, which this has that too, but it also how you place your tiles, or how you acquire tiles and how you place them is kind of a unique puzzle, because how it works is you're going to have these tiles laid out in the middle of the board in kind of a grid, and you're going to have 4 different architects, and each architect has a different number. So if you play your number 2 architect, what that basically means is you count in 2 spaces and you get the second tile. Now it's a grid, but you can kind of place the architects anywhere around the grid. But it's always, you would count 2 tiles in, and the next one you place, let's say you place your number 3, it's going to be 3 tiles in. So you've kind of have to figure out that puzzle on which tiles you can acquire and which piece to use to get the tiles you want. And also, once you get that tile, you place them on your home board. They have to be in the same row as the number you place. So if it was a number 3 architect, then you've got your number 3 row that you got to place the tile on. And so you got to consider that as well. And then there's the synergy of how the tiles work together. So if you've got like parks next to apartments, they get bonus points. Or if you've got factories, they kind of create pollution, but you can place parks that's going to take away from that pollution. But you also need workers to work your factories. So your apartments, when you play apartment complex, they create people, and you take those people and put them in your factories to kind of turn, they use the people as energy for the factories. So there's just a lot of synergy in the tiles you place, and a lot of thinking and puzzly thinking as when you're trying to figure out how to place those tiles. And I like that a lot about this game. That is Quadropple. My number 26, in some ways I kind of waffled, and do I put this on this list or not? I'm saying, is this a board game? And in the end, I think it really is. And what I mean by that is, well, it's made by Games Workshop, and they're known for like Warhammer 40K, a lot of miniature games. And this one has a high miniature component, but it really, at the heart of it, is really a board game. And that is Blood Bowl. Now, Blood Bowl is true fantasy football. And, where people think of fantasy football, it's kind of like getting on the computer, drafting different players, and then watching NFL games to see how those players do. But this one is like fantasy football with orcs and goblins and elves and dwarves, and it does a really, really good job with that theme and incorporating that theme into the game. Like the orcs are really like tough and all about beating their opponent's faces in more than even playing football. And the elves are going to be what you'd imagine. They're very dexterous, so like weaving in and out of tackle zones, and they're really good at like throwing and catching, and the more agile or agility based kind of concepts of football. And so it incorporates a lot of that into the game. And really where this game shines is really league play, because if you play in a league with Blood Bowl, it's almost as an RPG element to it, where you're going to get different star player points or experience points based on different action or different things you do in the course of a game. Like you score a touchdown, that player is going to get experience points, or if you knock somebody out, you're going to get experience points for that player. And you take those experience points and you can buy more skills, like they're leveling up like an RPG. And so that's where the Blood Bowl really, really shines. Now my next ones, the next 5 on this list are very, very similar. They all kind of tie together, and that was kind of by accident, but it really kind of makes sense, because similar games or similar types of games, I feel makes sense that I would like them similarly. And to start off that, and basically what I mean by that is all these games have a strong story element or storytelling element. And to start off with my number 25 is Near and Far. Now, Near and Far, as I mentioned, has a storytelling element to the game. And what I mean by that is you go on different quests. And with those quests, it's sort of like a choose your own adventure. So you'll like go to a quest, and then another player will read you kind of a paragraph or two about something that's on that quest, and then it'll give you options. It could be like you've come across some sort of merchant, and that merchant says like, someone has stolen his fish cart. And so you're going to decide if you're going to try to help the merchant, and it will tell you the difficulty of that task. It won't tell you what happens. It'll just say, well, this one takes a difficulty of 6. Or you may try to, maybe you ignore the merchant, you just go on about your business. And that might have another difficulty of like 4 or something like that. So you decide which one you want to do, and then you make your roll. And then based on your success or failure of that, or how much you succeed by, because if you succeed by 2 more, like if it was a difficulty of 6 and you got an 8, then you're going to get an extra bonus. And then the person who read you the paragraph is going to continue reading like the effect, sort of like a choose your own adventure kind of concept. But which there was an earlier game called Above and Below, which was very similar, it had that same kind of concept. But what Near and Far did is it really kind of improved upon the storytelling element of Above and Below. Where in Above and Below, you just had that kind of one-off thing. Here's your choose your own adventure, here's your reward or your penalty based on your action, and then you move on. In Near and Far, it actually has a campaign mode to it, and you can gain different traits based on like you might get the trait like a robot trait. And what that means is in a future quest, if you have the robot trait, you're going to have a different trigger, so something different is going to be happening based on your previous quest, maybe even a previous game. Or you may have follow-ups, so it will say part of the reward, you're also supposed to make a note. So next time you go on a quest, read this number instead. And so you're going to continue on the story of it. And that's really what the biggest strength of Near and Far is, these kind of continuing stories that you're going to play over a course of a campaign. My number 24, like I said, keeping with this kind of story, almost RPG-like, mixed with board game, and that is Time Stories. Now, Time Stories it's a cooperative game where you're going to be working together, and its kind of theme or concept is you're all time travelers. It's sort of like Quantum Leap, or a little bit of more like Quantum Leap, but you're in a group. Whereas, because what I mean by Quantum Leap is because you're going to, in the story, you're leaping into another person of that time period. And you're usually trying to solve some sort of thing that happened. But you're never going to be able to solve, at least in your first mission. You just don't have time, because everything you do takes time actions. And when you run out of time, you're kind of sucked back into what is your present, which would be our future. But it's like, but you're kind of sucked back to the beginning. But it's not all is lost, because you've learned different things. Like you may go, okay, we know, don't go down this corridor next time. So you're kind of making notes of what you need to do. Or you might say, we need to find this item to go to this other place. So you need to make a mental note of that or make a note of that. So next time you play a scenario, you know, okay, go get this item first and bring it to this other spot. So you're kind of building this kind of puzzle and trying to remember it each time you play it, which sounds a lot. Which is a lot harder than it sounds, because a lot of these scenarios we've played them back to back, and even though we just played the scenario, why can't we remember where that spray can is or whatever it is? And so that's what I kind of like about it. You know, like I mentioned before, I like puzzles, but this one I also like because of the different stories. And it, like an RPG, you have like different modules that you basically can plug in. And I'm not going to spoil it because that's part of the fun. Is when you go in, you don't even know what kind of game you're playing. You go in, you go like, oh wow, this is this type of genre. So I'm not going to really talk about the scenarios too much because I don't want to spoil them. But that's kind of neat because you do have different genres. So every time you play a mission, it can be a totally different game experience. And that's what I like about that one, and that's Time Stories. My number 23, speaking of like an RPGs, this is very much like classic Dungeons and Dragons. Now this game, when I first played it, or I had been playing it for off and on for years, I liked it, but it was never one of my favorite games. It was just kind of like, this is a really good game, but I could take it or leave it. But they came out with an app for it, which has made the game from good to great, and that is Descent. Now Descent, in its original form, you can still play it in its original form. It's sort of like an old HeroScape game, if you're familiar with HeroScape, or it's like a Dungeons and Dragons game without really the role playing. You're basically you have one person as the overlord, which is kind of like a dungeon master, and everybody else is playing a hero, and you're going through this dungeon crawl. What the difference is that the dungeon master is trying to win, whereas hopefully in role-playing games, the dungeon master is normally trying to work with the players, but in Descent, the dungeon master is trying to win the scenario versus the players. So it's like a one versus everybody else. And I thought that was fine, and it's a solid game, but it wasn't super really my cup of tea. But then when the app came out for it, the app basically took the role of the dungeon master, and so everybody got to play it as a cooperative game, and then that just blew this game through the stratosphere. How good it became, because I didn't really like that conflict. Maybe when it comes to role playing games, that's not why I play role playing. I've never been a power gamer in role playing, so I didn't like this kind of conflict versus this pseudo dungeon master. Also, it was really hard to find somebody who wanted to play the dungeon master in Descent. Or at least it was just as equally as difficult as it is to find somebody that wanted sometimes to play a dungeon master in D&D. And so I always kind of felt a lot of times, if we're going to go through all this effort, I just rather play D&D. But with the app, it's going to fulfill the dungeon master role for you. So all your friends, you can get together, and because I know, like I said, in role-playing games, even if I could find somebody to be a dungeon master, some of it was like, man, it'd be great if we could actually get together where we my group of friends could play together as players, and we could never find a game master for us. So one of us always had to be the game master. Well, in Descent, you can do that. So the app will be the game master for you, and you'll work together with your friends going through a dungeon crawl campaign. And that's my number 23, yes. Now my number 22, now this is even most similar because of my number 22, is really the reason the app for Descent was created, and that is also by Fantasy Flight. That is Mansions of Madness. Like Descent, this is the biggest Mansions of Madness second edition. There was a first edition of Mansions of Madness, which, like Descent, you had somebody who effectively was a game master trying to beat the other players. In second edition Mansions of Madness, it only can be played with an app, with the app being the game master. So it's very comparable to Descent, sort of like a dungeon crawl, though you're where you lay different tiles out. But this one tends to be more like a mansion. You're going through more like where the other one's more like dungeon. This is going to be different horror, I guess, landscapes, and it's because there's horror landscapes because it's a Lovecraft game. So like a very like Cthulhu themed Lovecraftian horror. And so, why I like it better than Descent, I'm going to set this down because it's very heavy. It's a lot of box there. But why I like it better than Descent, where Descent is kind of like a D&D, or Dungeon Master's D&D game, and it does have stories in it. It's more about the dungeon crawl, fighting things, killing things, getting treasure. Mansions of Madness is definitely much more story driven, and you get more engrossed in the story. And the story is much more important to the game, even though Descent has story elements in it. Mansions of Madness is more about the story, and the stories are a lot. Maybe it's just because I like the Lovecraftian horror, but the stories I think are a lot better and more engaging than in Descent, and so that's why Mansions of Madness gets a nod over Descent. And then the last one of my video is another story-driven game, and that is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. Now, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective is sort of like a super choose-your-own-adventure game. And in some ways, actually, this is sort of like Blood Bowl, where I kind of waffled. I put this on my list because I'm not sure in some ways if this is a board game. Because in some ways, I'm not even sure if it's a game. But one thing I can be sure about it is I like it a lot. And what it is sort of like I said, a super choose-your-own-adventure game. Except in a choose-your-own-adventure game, a lot of times they will tell you, or a choose-your-own-adventure book, they'll tell you your different options. Like, oh, if you want to go do this, turn to page such and such. If you want to go do that, turn to this different page. Well, Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective is sort of like that, except after you read like a page or two in the book, it's like a choose-your-own-adventure, except it doesn't give you the options. You've got to figure out the options yourself. And how you do that is you're going to have a map that you're on, that's going to have different location numbers you can go to, or you're going to have newspaper articles, which you got to read these newspapers to kind of mine clues, like your Sherlock Holmes themselves, kind of trying to guess things from the newspaper, or just from the page, like you have an introduction page, which usually takes place in like Sherlock Holmes' study, where some client comes in and tells you, the setup for the mystery, and you got to take that setup and figure, okay, now where should we go here? Should we, go to the crime scene, or should we go to this theater where this there's an actor that was mentioned that is the brother of the victim, or something like that. And so you kind of have to take these kind of clues that are kind of hidden in the story and try to figure out where to go from there. And when you go there, if you're lucky, hopefully there'll be some more information there, and then that leads you to new locations, and you kind of piece the story together. And also, for a game, it has really amazing writing, because these stories are just as good as like stories from like a Sherlock Holmes book or from a Sherlock Holmes TV show. And it's very, very rich and kind of like Victorian England just flavor. A lot of different references to the time period, and so it really makes it very easy to kind of be engrossed in, or just kind of be absorbed into the story. And I guess when it comes to what got me into gaming initially was like games like Dungeons and Dragons. And role playing games. And so it's no surprise that as we get closer and closer to the top, that games with strong story and strong theme is going to be very attractive to me. So, well, that's the end of this particular countdown. Hopefully you'll join me next time as I start to counting my number 20 to 11 in my next video. And as always, if you have any questions about any of these games or any games in general, feel free to stop into the Wizard's Keep, or you can message me on Facebook or comment here on YouTube. Until next time, thank you for watching.